In the first part of the explanation, I talked about uh, pancake material which was brought in truckloads, then the makeup department, then of the office boy, his frustration and his anger towards Kotmangalam Subbu, multi-talented person, tailor-made for film, uh, talented writer, talented actor, as well as a very charitable and improvident man. He was a part of the story department. And then about the lawyer who was instrumental in unwittingly bringing an end to the brilliant career of an actress, and how he was different from others. And then the political thought of the people at Gemini Studio, who were more inclined towards Gandhiji's preaching and all that, and they considered communism and communist to be a bane for the society, a curse for the society. When Frank Bookman's Moral Rearmament Army, some 200 strong, visited Madras sometime in 1952, they could not have found a warmer host in India than the Gemini Studios. Someone called the group an international circus. People thought that they were circus people. But the author says they weren't very good on trapeze. Trapeze is that act which is done in the circus. And their acquaintance with animals was only at the dinner table. Means their acquaintance, what we can say, the Chan Pehchan or something like that, with the animals was limited only at the dinner table. Means they were non-vegetarian and that was their connection with the animals. We know in circus there are animals and there are acts of animals which are performed. But they presented two plays in a most professional manner. Their Jotham Valley and Forgotten Factor ran several shows in Madras, and along with the other citizens of the city, the Gemini family of 600 saw the plays over and over again. The message of the plays were usually plain and simple homilies, but the sets and costumes were first rate. Madras and the Tamil drama community were terribly impressed, and for some years almost all Tamil plays had a scene of sunrise and sunset in the manner of Jotham Valley, with a bare stage, a white background curtain, and a tune played on the flute. So that was the effect of the plays which were presented by this moral rearmament army. It was some years later that I learned that the MRA was a kind of counter movement to international communism, against communism. And big bosses of Madras like Mr. Vasan simply played into their hands. Now see, at that time there was a prevalent belief in South India and in the people among the people of Gemini Studios about the communist and the communism. They were considered to be someone who were creating disturbance all around. They were not God-fearing people or something like that. Many years later, author came to know that MRA was a kind of counter movement to international communism, and that was one of the reasons why they were so warmly welcomed at Gemini Studio. I'm not sure, however, that this was indeed the case, for the unchangeable aspects of these bosses and their enterprises remained the same. MRA or no MRA, international communism or no international communism. But he says that maybe people believe that Mr. Vasan played into their hands, but that was not really the case, because it hardly made any difference on the way these big bosses played their games, whether MRA or no MRA, whether international communism or no international communism. They did their things in their own way. But it was definitely a change for the staff of Gemini Studios. The staff of Gemini Studios had a nice time hosting 200 people of all hues and sizes, of at least 20 nationalities. It was such a change from the usual collection of crowd players waiting to be slapped with thick layers of makeup by the office boy in the makeup department. So it was a welcome change for everyone at Gemini Studio. A few months later, the telephone lines of the big bosses of Madras burst, and once again we at Gemini Studios cleared a whole shooting stage to welcome another visitor. So a few months later, there was another visitor at Gemini Studio. All they said was that he was a poet from England. The information was the guest, the visitor who was going to come, was a poet from England. The only poets from England the simple Gemini staff knew or heard of were Wordsworth and Tennyson. The more literate ones knew of Keats, Shelley, and Byron, and one or two might have faintly come to know of someone by the name Eliot, T.S. Eliot. So these are the great names. So these were the names which were known to the people at Gemini Studios. So they had never heard about this poet. Who was the poet visiting the Gemini Studios now? So there was a question in the mind of everyone. He is not a poet, he is an editor. That's why the boss is giving him a big reception. So there was another guess that the visitor was not a poet, but he was actually an editor, and that was the reason why boss was giving such a reception. Vasan, owner of Gemini Studio, was also the editor of the popular Tamil weekly Ananda Vikatan. He wasn't the editor of any of the known names of British publications in Madras, but this visitor who was coming, no one had heard his name. Since the top men of the Hindu were taking the initiative, the surmise was that the poet was the editor of a daily. But the Hindu, you all may have heard the name, the Hindu, one of the famous newspapers published in India from Madras. They were the ones, the Hindu people were taking the initiative, and so everyone came to a conclusion that most probably it was not the poet but the editor. But he was not an editor of some renowned daily or renowned newspapers, but not from the Manchester Guardian or the London Times. That was all that even the most well-informed among us knew. Now this was the information. Even the most informed had only this much of information. So there was a great suspense who was coming, a poet or an editor. At last, around 4 in the afternoon, the poet or the editor arrived. He was a tall man, very English, very serious, and of course very unknown to all of us. Battling with half a dozen pedestal fans on the shooting stage, the boss read out a long speech. It was obvious that he too knew precious little about the poet or the editor. So a welcome speech was read by Mr. Vasan, and from his speech one could understand that even Mr. Vasan, the boss of the Gemini Studio, had very little idea about this poet or the editor who was the visitor. The speech was all in most general terms, but here and there it was peppered with the words like freedom and democracy. Then the poet spoke. He couldn't have addressed a more dazed and silent audience. Everyone was dazed, surprised, silent. No one knew what he was talking about, and his accent defeated any attempts to understand what he was saying. Now everyone who was sitting over there, listening, they could not. And some people who tried, but they could not follow the accent, and they were not able to understand what he was saying. The whole thing lasted about an hour, and then the poet left, and we all dispersed in utter bafflement, confusion. What are we doing? Everyone was confused. Everyone was just, what you can say, in a confusion, bafflement, that what they were doing there. There was a question in the mind of everyone. What is an English poet doing in a film studio which makes Tamil films for the simplest sort of people? People whose lives least afforded them the possibility of cultivating a taste for English poetry. The poet looked very baffled too. Even the poet, the guest, the visitor who had come, he also looked confused. For he too must have felt the sheer incongruity. Incongruity is mismatch of his talk about the thrills and travails of an English poet. His visit remained an unexplained mystery. No one knew what was the reason behind the visit of that English poet. The great prose writers of the world may not admit it, but my conviction grows stronger day after day that prose writing is not and cannot be the true pursuit of a genius. He says that prose writers would not accept this particular theory, but he feels that for being a prose writer, there is no need of being a genius. But there are certain other qualities which are required for a successful prose writer. A prose writing is for the patient, persistent, persevering drudge with a heart so shrunken that nothing can break it. A prose writer should be patient. persistent, continuously, persevering, going on, and heart so shrunken that it has no effect of any rejection. The rejection slips don't mean anything to him. He at once sets about making a fresh copy of the long prose piece and sends it on to another editor, enclosing postage for the return of the manuscript. It was for such people that the Hindu had published a tiny announcement in an insignificant corner of an unimportant page. Now look at the way author says this. Tiny announcement, insignificant corner, unimportant page. It was a story writing contest for the prose writers, organized by a British periodical by the name The Encounter. Of course, The Encounter wasn't a known commodity among the Gemini literati. I wanted to get an idea of the periodical before I spent a considerable sum in postage sending a manuscript to England. Those days, we did not have this email facility or something like that. So the things were sent by mail and it cost quite some. So before author wanted to participate in it, so before sending his manuscript to England, he wanted to ascertain whether it was worth sending or not. So he went to the British Library. In those days, British Council Library had an entrance with no long winded signboards and notices to make you feel you were sneaking into a forbidden area. He said that it means there was not so much of restriction over there. It was easily accessible. That is what he wants to say. And there were copies of The Encounter lying about in various degrees of freshness, almost untouched by readers. And when he went there, he saw the magazine Encounter, hardly touched by anyone. And that disappointed the author. But when he read the editor's name, he says he heard a bell ringing in his shrunken heart. When he read the name of the editor, he was hopeful, overjoyed. It was the poet who had visited the Gemini studios. So it was the same poet who had come over there, and everyone was at suspense that what was the mystery behind poet's visit to the Gemini studios. But when he saw his name over there, author was very much happy. I felt like I had found a long lost brother, and I sang as I sealed the envelope and wrote out his address. I felt that he too would be singing the same song at the same time. Long lost brothers of Indian films discover each other by singing the same song in the first reel and in the final reel of the film. Many of the movies, lost and found movies, you must have seen or you must have heard or you must have heard some people talking about it, that uh, whole family together singing a song and then a catastrophe happens and everyone is away from each other and no one knows where they have gone, and finally in the end of the movie the same song being sung and everyone is united. So lost and found cases of the Indian movie. So he felt like that. And why he was so happy? He was so happy because it was Stephen Spender. Stephen Spender was the visitor who had visited Gemini Studio. And I hope every one of you know Stephen Spender, An Elementary School Classroom in a Slum, that poem by Stephen Spender. He was the visitor at the Gemini Studios. Years later, when I was out of Gemini Studios and I had much time but not much money, anything at a reduced price attracted my attention. So when he was no more working at Gemini Studio, he says that he had too much of time but not so much of money. So anything which was cheaper in rate, reduced price, always attracted his attention. On the footpath in the front of the Madras Mount Road post office, there was a pile of brand new books for 50 paise each. Actually, they were copies of the same book, an elegant paperback of American origin, special low price student edition in connection with the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. I paid 50 paise and picked up a copy of the book, The God That Failed. So, what was the name of that book? The God That Failed. Six eminent men of letters in six separate essays described their journeys into communism and their disillusioned return. This was actually the collection of essays by six eminent men of letters, six eminent authors. In their six separate essays, had described their journey into communism. Means once upon a time they were advocates, they were in favor of communism, but later on they were disillusioned. They felt that communism had not served its purpose. And now these people who were the contributors of those essays were Andre Gide, Richard Wright, Ignatius Silon, Arthur Koestler, Louis Fisher, and Stephen Spender. So Louis Fisher, again, one of the names you are aware of, the chapter Indigo. So these were the writers. And when author saw Stephen Spender, suddenly the book assumed tremendous significance. Suddenly that book became very important for the author, Stephen Spender, the poet who had visited Gemini Studios. In a moment I felt a dark chamber of my mind lit up by a hazy illumination. And he felt that as if the dark corner of his mind was illuminated, brightened. The reaction to Stephen Spender at Gemini Studios was no longer a mystery. Now he realized why Stephen Spender was so warmly welcomed at Gemini Studios. Can you guess it why? Reason? Stephen Spender was against communism, and we all know the people at Gemini Studio, their feelings were against communism. The boss of the Gemini Studios may not have much to do with Spender's poetry, but not with his God that failed. Huh? S.S. Vasan may not have any interest in his work as an English poet, but certainly he wanted to play that card to get that, what you can say, acknowledged for inviting someone who was against communism. The God that failed. The God here is considered to be communism. And that book, The God That Failed, talks about the failure of communism. Failure of communism. And Stephen Spender was one of the contributors in that book. And that was the reason why he was so warmly welcomed at Gemini Studios. Now here we come to the end of the chapter. But here you see, this chapter shows you how to develop an article. Now if you look at, begins with Pancakes, makeup department, office boy, Subu, lawyer, story department, MRA, coming of Spender, then prose writers, and then finally realizing why Stephen Spender was so warmly welcomed at Gemini Studios. Now every entire article, entire thing when you read, you feel that everything is connected from one point, ends and other, it is the beginning of the other point. And that is how an article should be written. So here we come to the end of the chapter, Poets and Pancakes by Ashok Mitra.